Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Polgreen. I am the head of content at Gimlet, which is a podcast company that is part of Spotify. But that's a pretty new thing. I spent most of my career running, doing daily news. I was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times for many years. I was also an editor there. I later became editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, and one of the first things I did was change its name to HuffPost because that's what everybody called it. Then made the big leap to podcasts about 4 months ago. It's been really crazy starting a new job in a new medium during a time of pandemic. I have met most of my colleagues and coworkers virtually. And I'm learning a lot about how audio gets made, and that's been really exciting. I think it's one of the most extraordinary forms of storytelling to emerge as a mass phenomenon in a very long time, and it's really exciting to be part of it. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about journalism and careers, and glad to be sharing the stage today with my old friend Peter Kafka. The friendship is old, not Peter.
I'm also old. It's my birthday yesterday. I'm
Happy birthday, older. Peter.
Thank you. It's a fun post-birthday present for me. Thanks, Lydia. I'm Peter Kafka. I'm not sure what my title is. I think I'm like a senior correspondent at Vox's Recode site. I cover media and technology and where they intersect. I write about that sometimes. I just wrote about Netflix's earnings today. I often podcast about it. A big part of my job has been running the Recode Media podcast for the last 4.5 years. I also host conferences like the Code Conference and the Code Media Conference. I don't know when those will return because there's a global pandemic. I did not set out to be a professional podcaster. I feel very lucky that I can actually do that for a living, though. I wanted to be a daily newspaper reporter like Lydia. I could not find a job at a newspaper out of college in 1993. I stumbled into business reporting, not because I wanted to, just because I found a job at something called the Minnesota Real Estate Journal, and discovered that I thought business news was interesting. I'd also read Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis, which convinced me that you could tell interesting stories about business. And over the years, that's what I've tried to do. At Recode, I wanted us to get into podcasting earlier than we did because I was hearing people like Bill Simmons and Adam Carolla, and then a lot of the venture capitalists that I was paying attention to were doing their own podcast. It was kind of a novelty. We thought we might do it as a company. We went out and looked for advice from people who knew about audio. We went to the CEO of Clear Channel Communications, a guy named Bob Pittman, who'd started MTV. He told us we should not do podcasts because that was a waste of time. We should do terrestrial radio. We tried that for a minute. It was terrible. And now Bob Pittman and Clear Channel are spending a lot of money trying to buy podcasts and compete with Lydia. One more thing. In addition to doing the Recode Media interview show I do, we have now created something called Land of the Giants. It's a narrative podcast. This one is about Netflix. We've produced 5 of 7 episodes. We've got 2 more to make, which is a whole different challenge for me. It's very different than the work I've done up until this point in my career. I really find that interesting. And I'm literally learning how to do it as we go. So I'm happy to answer questions. And some things I don't know because I'm figuring out for myself, just like Lydia. That's a pretty good intro, right? Yeah,
I think it's a great intro. I think if I may, I think one of the lessons from both of our careers is you got to start somewhere. Your first job was in business journalism, and it set you down a path that I think has led to you doing pretty extraordinary things. In my case, my first job was actually an internship at a policy magazine in Washington, D.C. I thought I was interested in policy. It turned out that I wasn't. But the experience there is what made me realize that what I really wanted to be doing was daily journalism. And so I went to journalism school, and I managed to get a job at a newspaper in upstate New York. So I think that the moral of the story is that, where you start is not necessarily where you end up, but you got to start somewhere.
And I'll append to that as well, because I've given one of these talks before to younger people, and I did not want to be starting at the Minnesota Real Estate Journal after I graduated college. It was not my plan. I did not want to write about light industrial warehouses and the Mall of America. But the advantage of being where you guys are, which is you have basically very little work experience and not a lot of credentials, is you have a ton of flexibility. Everyone's experience is different. Everyone has different sets of weights, but you are probably the least encumbered now that you're going to be over the course of your career. So say yes to things, try things. If you do something for 6 months and a year and you decide it doesn't work out, it's not for you, that's great. It's not a bad thing to try a bunch of different things. And you will, as your career goes on, you will have less flexibility. You will accumulate debts and responsibilities, which can be great things as well. But try a lot of stuff is my number one piece of advice for you guys. Should we take actual questions?
Let's take some actual questions. Let's do it. First one is, what is the best place to look for a list of the most popular podcasts by listeners? That's a great question, and it's not as simple to answer as you might think. Spotify, the company that I work for, just released its own charts for podcasts, and those charts are based on actual listener data, what people are listening to on Spotify. But the Spotify, the podcast landscape is pretty fractured. So, there's no one source of truth for what are the most popular podcasts, and the people that are listening to podcasts on different platforms look kind of demographically different. So, Apple has its charts, and those are very powerful and influential, but it measures downloads, and a lot of people download podcasts, and then never listen to them. They're like, yes, I'm going to listen to this podcast to learn all about, this MIT philosophy course because I've always wanted to do it. How many of, if you could raise hands, how many of you have aspirationally subscribed to a podcast feed and then never actually listened to them? And suddenly you're queuing up the next episode of Who Weekly to find out what all the celebrity gossip is instead. So anyway, so the Spotify charts is one place to look. The Apple charts is another place to look. I think there's more journalism about podcasts now, and I think the New York Times is doing more coverage of the podcasting world. There are a bunch of different newsletters you can sign up for, but discovery remains a pretty serious problem for the podcasting industry. Figuring out what everybody's looking at, what everybody's talking about in this space is actually not as easy as it should be, and something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Podcasts don't tend to go viral, for example, because they're in a different medium. So I would check out the Spotify charts. You can check out the Apple ones too, but they're it's not always easy to find the great thing that you want to listen to. So that's something we're really thinking about a lot.
I just want to make sure I'm doing it. Should we just be going down in order here? Yeah.
Okay. We can, or you can pick and choose. Up to you.
The best way for an aspiring podcaster to get experience recording or editing their own audio, any online classes. I can't tell you about classes. I've never taken one. I do think, and this is an analogy you probably have heard before, we're in an age of podcasting that's a little bit like blogging 5 or 6 years ago. It's very easy to physically create the thing. Lydia's company has at least 2 different apps I think you can use. My kids have been using Anchor, and there's a second one, right? It's slightly fancier. There's apps you can use like Anchor to actually record the thing. Test it out as much as you can. Try it out. The making of the podcast is in many ways the easiest thing to do. Distributing and finding an audience is going to be harder, but that's not your main concern right now. I would actually just work on hearing your voice, figuring out how to record someone else's voice. If you're going to try to create a narrative podcast, that's a whole other trip, but figure out how you might write a story and inject bits of audio that you've recorded. It's super low stakes. You really can't screw up. And the nice thing is at this stage, no one's going to hear what you've made beyond you and your friends. I don't know about an online class, and I don't know that I would suggest taking.
I'm going to drop into the chat a website that I recently discovered. It's called howtomakeapodcast.org, and it is a free resource that was actually created by a young podcaster who is much closer to the age of the folks on this call than me. Her name is Misha Youssef, and she is, I believe she's Pakistani American, has done a bunch of really cool things in podcasting. But the really cool thing that she's done most recently is and it was just announced today, is she's making a podcast. Michelle Obama is making a podcast, and Misha, her company, is helping to produce that podcast. But I discovered that she has this online course, and all you have to do is put in your email address to sign up for it. And it's got a lot of really useful information, starting from the beginning. How do you know? How do you know the different parts of what makes a good podcast? So, I played around with it a little bit. I think it's pretty interesting. Seems worth checking out. Also, check out Michelle Obama's podcast, which will be dropping soon.
What do you think about the idea of learning podcasting as opposed to learning journalism and interviewing? I'm biased towards the latter because that's how I did it, because podcasting didn't exist when I started, and I'm a little wary of advising people about technical stuff when I think the roots of it are learning how to ask someone a question, learning how to listen, learning how to tell a story. Which are things you want to do in any medium.
I think that there is a foundational layer of just being a really good journalist that you have to have in order to be successful in podcasting. If you're doing, whether you're doing narrative nonfiction, if you're doing an interview show, if it's, there are lots of different kinds of podcasts, but anything that's got a kind of journalistic factual bent, you're going to need to have the foundational skills to be a good journalist. That said, I do think that there are some very specific skills that are unique to audio, and interviewing for audio, I think, is completely different than interviewing for a text interview, right? Choosing your subjects, who you're going to interview for audio, is very different than choosing who you're going to interview for a text piece or for a video piece, right? Editing for audio, particularly in a narrative context, is very, very different. How many characters you can have in a story, because people will lose track, without being able to tell people's names apart, people's voices apart, without visual cues. So I think that yes, you absolutely need a basic foundation in journalism, and a very strong one at that. But I think that understanding the medium and the ways in which you can tell stories most richly in it is also really important to being successful in podcasting.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Again, repetition, trying stuff out, failing a lot. I guess it's technically possible that one day when you're very successful and thrust into a high profile job, someone is going to find your embarrassing podcast you made this year, whatever the version of getting in trouble for your old tweets. But so just don't say terrible racist and misogynistic things and you should be fine. There was a question that someone submitted earlier about whether or not you can launch a podcast without sort of already having a platform, without being known by someone. And I think the answer is it's going to be pretty hard. I think it was easier when podcasting was a very, very new medium. But even then, if you look at people who had initial success in podcasting, they tended to be people who came out of radio, right? That's the most obvious analog, or someone who already worked at a large media outlet that was allowed to do podcasts. That's the Bill Simmons story. And I think there is a chance for Spotify in particular, given the way their sort of machine learning works, to find podcasts that no one knows about and figure out that you might want to listen to it. But I think it's probably unlikely. I think they are likely, just in the same way they present music to you by Ariana Grande instead of someone you've never heard of, they're more likely to give you Ariana Grande as opposed to someone in their basement. And I think the truth is, if you are going to launch a podcast that's going to be heard by more than you and your friends, you probably are going to need some kind of boost. But I would like to hear what Lydia says about that.
No, I think that's right, and I think it's interesting because podcasting has been until quite recently like a very kind of wide open environment, and it reminds me a lot of the early blogging days, which those of us who are old enough to have been grown-ups in those days, I think have some nostalgia for it. it's based on RSS feeds that are, pretty easy to distribute, but very hard to discover. And, whenever a medium starts to grow up and gets catches the attention of big technology companies, like, they build on them and find ways to make richer content, and inevitably that involves the platforms changing, the distribution models changing, and that just gets more complicated, and it's much harder to have a breakout hit. I think that there are definitely examples of people, YouTube phenomenons, for example, who come out of nowhere and manage to build a really, really big audience, and that hasn't really happened in the audio space, which is interesting. And I think I wouldn't rule out that the technology could change in such a way that you could have a kind of coming out of nowhere viral success in audio, but it certainly hasn't happened yet.
And even for YouTube, right? The people who showed up on YouTube right away became famous because no one else was routinely.
No one else was doing it. Yeah.
And the bar for becoming popular on YouTube now is way harder. Just to
yes,
also people have higher expectations.
Yeah.
It's just still early, so go ahead and screw around. You never know.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's a great question here about podcasts that require a lot of work, investigative podcasts. It was and the questioner Joshua Dudley mentions one of my favorites, which is a podcast called Bundyville, which you should all check out. It is about the Bundy family in the American West, and it's a fascinating podcast about the federal government and ideas of the West and resistors to the government and so on. And yes, those kinds of podcasts are what a lot of people think of when they think of like kind of the highest form of podcasting, which is kind of deep investigative or documentary storytelling. They are really, really hard to do. They are very expensive to make, and they take a lot of time and a lot of editing and a lot of false starts. And this is the kind of work that we love to do at Gimlet. I think that the path to doing that kind of work is to first of all get really, really good at journalism. Investigative journalism is really hard, and learning how to be a top flight investigative journalist and building your skills around things like using the Freedom of Information Act, building your interviewing skills, building your skills to get people who don't want to talk to you. Those are going to be the first and most important foundational skills that you need in order to do investigative reporting in any environment. And once you're sort of down that path, I think if you really want to do it in audio, then I think you need to find a role, whether it's an internship or a entry level full time role as an associate producer or something like that, with a place that does the kind of work that you admire. And there are many. American Public Media, which did In the Dark, some extraordinary work that involved a case that ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court and getting a man who was on death row a new trial. Reveal, a show that's created by the Center for Investigative Reporting. They do extraordinary work on this. A bunch of NPR related things that do this work. Gimlet does. The New York Times, where I used to work, does a lot of very ambitious audio storytelling. So, but it really is the kind of work that I think requires institutional support, meaning like it's very hard to do on your own and to do credibly on your own.
Yeah, and jumping on that, one thing that I found a lot different about doing, especially this podcast I'm doing now, the Netflix podcast series, is that it's, and if you're doing investigative stuff, anything that's highly produced, it's going to be collaborative. You're going to work with a bunch of people in a way that a lot of traditional newspaper journalism and online journalism is often you by yourself, writing, learning, asking the questions, typing the stuff up, and depending on what kind of operation you're doing, you may hit publish yourself. And there are versions of that for podcasting too. You can do an interview podcast by yourself if you want to. People do it. But the more complex these things are, the more people are going to be involved, the more collaborative it's going to be. It's very unlikely that you are going to be steering one of these things yourself. Again, the good news here is you can attach yourself to a project sort of in a low level position and just learn a ton. Savannah has a question that's along the same lines or relevant to this about needing experience in more than one form of media. I don't think you have to have it, but I would definitely advise trying as many things as you can. Like I said before, I think your employers will often expect you to be able to do more than one thing. When I was starting out, you didn't write your own headlines when you wrote a story. An editor did that. Now you write your own headlines, you write your own tweets. You may be expected to find art for a story, and all that stuff sort of didn't exist when I was starting out. And these are tasks you're going to want to learn on your own. And so, even if you don't want to be on TV, you might play around with video and see what that looks like. Even if you don't want to be writing print stories, you definitely should be trying those. It will make you more employable. If you're fantastic at one particular thing, that's great. If you're a normal person and you're decent at a bunch of different things, that's great too.
Yeah, I think being a Swiss Army knife is really important in this business. It changes all the time. I started out in an era when print was everything, and the internet was really just kind of this thing off to the side. When I first started at the New York Times, the website was in a separate building from the print operation. They were that separate, and I've just seen tremendous changes over the course of my career. And I think being flexible and having skills that can go across multiple media is really vital. I think that the important thing though is there's a term for this. It's called being T-shaped. That you should have a broad array of skills, but be really deep in one thing. And having depth and expertise on a particular thing that you can take with you, whether you're working in audio, in video, in text, or whatever comes next, I think is really important. Peter obviously has done that over the course of his career and has become one of the leading reporters on media and tech in the entire industry. So, I think it's a great model to follow, to find a thing you're really passionate about, get really, really good at it, and be pretty agnostic about the medium in which you tell your stories, because that's going to change over time.
There's a question here from Schiffer about trying to increase listenership for new podcasts. It is going to be challenging. Take some comfort in the fact that everyone is struggling with it. In the old days, i.e. a couple of years ago, when everyone was trying to do video, and all the publishers were focused on that, the idea was you would jam your video into a Facebook feed, and Facebook would magically shoot it out to a bunch of people, and there were a lot of problems with that model. That's gone away. There has not been, from what we can tell, any kind of social model for podcasting other than get someone. We tend to find a lot of people who listen to podcasts, listen to other podcasts, and the way they discover new podcasts is by hearing about those podcasts and the podcasts they already listen to. So short answer is get on other podcasts if you can, get them to promote you. That's an audience that wants to hear more of the stuff you're making. And so if you know someone who's got a moderately successful podcast or a podcast that has one more listener than you, or even the same number of listeners as you, try to figure out if there's some way to collaborate is the really only answer I have for you.
Yeah. No, I would echo that. I think it's I think growing an audience for a podcast is one of the really it's a big challenge. And I think setting goals for yourself of like, if you choose a topic, the topic is probably or an idea, the topic is probably, if you're passionate about it, there are probably other people that are passionate about it. So seeking out those other people and where they might be gathering, it may not be on Twitter, it may be on Reddit, or it may be, a Facebook group, in the particular place that you're focused on. Start in those places and build from there. I mean, I think putting something out into the world in a kind of broadcast way, I think doesn't really work anymore. You have to find people who are really passionate about the thing that you're wanting to that you're talking about on your podcast, and then getting it out to that kind of passionate community first, and then see if you can grow it from there.
Yvonne has a question about preparing guest speakers when using podcasts or live videos for interviews. I don't do a lot of prep with the people I interview, especially for the sort of interview shows. The premise is this is journalism, and I'm going to ask them questions. I don't want them to be overly prepared. I would never send them a list of questions I'm going to ask them, because what's the point of that? And the main asks are usually pretty technical. Like, can you get yourself in a quiet room with a decent speaker, with a good Wi-Fi connection? It's gotten much more complicated over the last 4 months to do all that. I think the preparation is all on your end as the interviewer, learning as much as you can about the person, having an idea of what you want to ask them about, listening carefully enough to their answers. So when they say something that's interesting, you ask them more about that instead of going on to your next question. Again, this is all sort of basic journalism that will work in any format to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things that I've learned as I've gone from text to audio is that particularly when you're making a narrative podcast, you're less, you're essentially kind of casting someone when you're wanting to interview them for your podcast. So you really want to interview not just for their expertise, but also for how they sound, how they express themselves. Depending on what you're looking for, is this someone that you really want the audience to connect with and root for? We think a lot about in choosing guests about representation and diversity, and making sure that we are, selecting people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives. I think another thing just about interviewing in general that I think a lot of people don't realize, because it's uncomfortable, is like, you can't fill the silence, and particularly in an audio interview where you really want to get this person's voice. Sometimes you just got to kind of sit there and let them fill the silence. It's awkward, and it's not what we do in human conversation, but it's absolutely essential in journalism in general, but particularly in audio journalism.
It's great in journalism in general. It's also a good sales technique. Yeah. And journalism and sales have a lot of crossover in that you're trying to get someone to accomplish something for you. You can't do this on a date or with your friends, but if you can find the time to sort of like have a conversation in which you don't respond right away to someone's answer, you will magically see them start to say more words, which can be very helpful for podcasting.
We have a question here from Manya about fiction podcasts, which this is a journalism class, but we'll allow it because this is actually a subject I'm really passionate about. I think that there's been a lot of excitement for fiction podcasting and the possibilities of fiction and audio. It's grown over the past few years. Obviously, Gimlet, where I work, had a huge success with Homecoming, which then became a TV show starring Julia Roberts. It's now in a new season starring Janelle Monáe, which is incredibly exciting. We've had other really successful fiction shows, things like Mother Hacker, The Horror of Dolores Roach, The Two Princes, which is a kind of YA fantasy story. That's delightful and queer and really, really wonderful. So there's a lot happening in that space, and I'm really excited about it. I've been thinking a lot about what the difference is between an audiobook and a podcast. Audiobooks are very popular, but they're popular with kind of older folks, and I sort of wonder whether that's a format that needs to be reinvented. In the same way that there is a version of Little Women brought to film and TV for every generation, I'd love for there to be a version of Little Women or Pride and Prejudice or Moby Dick or what have you for new generations, but in an audio format. So that's definitely something that I'm thinking about. And a lot of the folks that we work with on the fiction side are people who either have a background in film and TV or actually who come from the theater world. So playwrights, directors, people like that. So it's been neat to get to work with some of that talent.
Miriam asks if it's necessary to major in or go to journalism school to have a good foundation in journalism. The answer is no, but I can expand on that. I got a journalism degree in Wisconsin, mostly because it was easy to do. I definitely learned a couple things in a couple classes, but almost everything I've learned has been on the job. It doesn't mean you shouldn't take a journalism class. There's not benefit to it. The best advice I ever got was not to go to graduate school in journalism and to take whatever money I would have spent on that and move myself somewhere and do the work. I think that is still the case. I think that the best thing a journalism program can do for you is help you get placed somewhere, which may be worth a lot of money. But I think more often than not, they're not going to deliver on that. But I would like to hear from Lydia, since she also went to journalism school.
I did. And, you absolutely do not have to major in or go to journalism school. I think that the place where professional schools are most powerful and helpful is that they essentially provide you networks, and the network of people that you meet and have access to through a journalism program could be really valuable. And they're different kinds of networks. I went to Columbia Journalism School. I went in part because I got a full scholarship. I was very, very lucky. And if I'd been facing paying full freight, I think I might have felt differently about that, but I had a great experience there, and I think having gone there definitely played a role in me landing a job at the New York Times at the age of 26, because I caught the eye of a recruiter at the New York Times who was teaching as an adjunct at Columbia. So but I think that my experience is rare, and the exception rather than the rule. I think there are lots of different ways to have a really great career in journalism, and there are also lots of different kinds of journalism programs, and I think that I'm a big admirer of the CUNY program in New York City, which serves an incredibly diverse population and offers incredibly good value in terms of tuition for in-state. I've worked with many graduates of that program. It's a terrific place. And there are lots of other ways to get experience too. I mean, obviously, if you go to a school that has a strong college paper, working on that is a really good way to build up your skills and get some journalism bona fides, and also have a kind of network, because college papers tend to produce journalists, and therefore they build in a network of people you can tap into when you're out there looking for your first job.
So Ian here has a question about whether the growth of podcasts are enough to make other editorial work sustainable, or shifting it entirely. And he's pointing out that we've got layoffs. There's layoffs at my employer today. Publications have gone under, more and more podcasts emerging. I think they're two different ideas. Journalism has lots of challenges in terms of being a functional business, particularly in local news. It's very grim. And the fact that you're seeing a lot of podcasts proliferate doesn't mean that they're making a lot of money. As we're demonstrating here, it's very easy to do podcasting. And so just making a podcast in the same way that publishing a blog doesn't mean you've got a business. That said, because they're cheap, they are attractive to a lot of publishers. When we got to Vox Media, my company was acquired by Vox Media 5 years ago. Everyone was doing podcasts, but no one was monetizing it. And they realized, for not very much money, we can build a business here. That's attractive. And also they're growing very fast from a very small base, which is also attractive to both investors and media company owners. So you see a lot of people who weren't paying attention to podcasts, like I told you in my intro story, who are paying attention to it now because it is a growth area in a landscape where there's not a lot of growth.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I also think media companies are thinking that are doing smart things in podcasting are thinking about the role of podcasts in their overall kind of portfolio in a really smart way. I really admire the way the New York Times has kind of executed its audio strategy. The Daily, I think it's a juggernaut. First of all, it's an incredibly popular podcast. When we launched our Spotify charts, it was immediately the number one podcast on the chart. And I think, and I don't know because I don't work there anymore, but I would, if I had to kind of put my thinking cap on and think about what's the primary role of that show, it's it's I would say probably most valuable to them as a form of marketing, and a way to get to get people who aren't subscribers to the New York Times to fall in love with the New York Times. And they sell ads against it. There are lots of other ways in which it's valuable, but people have asked, like, oh well, why don't they put the Daily behind a paywall, because so much New York Times journalism is behind a paywall. But I'm guessing that the strategy is that this is a great way for people to get introduced to what the New York Times is, particularly people who don't necessarily think of themselves as newspaper readers. And I think that it's played a pretty big role in their subscriber growth. So I think that podcasts are doing lots of different jobs for media companies. The advertising piece of it, I think, remains underdeveloped and really important. And it's become harder and harder for marketers to find ways to get their messages to customers. People are opting out, they're tuning out, they're disgusted by the big platforms and annoyed by advertising and paying extra to avoid advertising, et cetera. And particularly host reads and other kinds of integrations of advertising, and we could talk about the ethics of all of those things too if anyone is interested. Is a very engaging way for marketers to reach people. So I think it remains a space where there's still a significant amount of money to be made, and everybody thinks that there's a lot more value there. So I think it's here to stay, and it's going to be a big part of the ecosystem going forward.
I hope it's here to stay. Amanda wants to know about identifying a good interview for audio. And this tacks back to something Lydia was saying as well about that I was curious about, because I think about it a lot. I also have the same question about when I'm putting people on stage at a conference, which is that one of the reasons you often see the same people interviewed at a conference or on a podcast or anywhere. Sometimes they're available. They make themselves available. A lot of times they're good at answering those kinds of questions, which isn't a bad thing, but you do end up sort of narrowing the kinds of people you have on stage, you have in a podcast that you go to, partly because it's easy to do it. And then for on stage and audio, an additional barrier is, will this person be able to communicate effectively? And there are all kinds of tricky questions that come along that. There's a few different people that I would like to have a conversation with, record a conversation with. I'm loath to do it because they have heavy accents. And I'm worried the audience won't be able to get through their accent. And you can obviously see why that's a problem. But I don't know how to solve it. You always want people who are well-spoken. And I'm really just sort of confessing here. I just don't know how to solve that problem and not getting the same kinds of speakers who know how to speak a certain way. And by the way, those often may not even be the most interesting people you'd want to hear from anyway. They just turns out they're good at speaking professionally. Maybe they don't have an operating role in the company, or maybe they literally are a spokesperson, but you don't want to hear from the spokesperson. You want to hear from someone who's actually doing the work. And I don't know how we solve that in audio. I know radio has struggled with it for a long time.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that that doing an interview for audio, like I said earlier, is really in some ways kind of more like casting. But I think you want to find people that express their ideas in a way that is going to be engaging for people and accessible. And accents can be a barrier, or they can also invite you in, or add a level of intrigue. So I think having a pretty open mind about those things and helping your audience hear voices that they need to hear, I think is really important.
I'll take this one for Lydia. She's got a cough. Christine has a question about podcasts, the idea of podcasts being newsy or evergreen, and which is better. And had this been a couple of years ago, I would have said, it's easy. They always want these to be evergreen because podcast listening is asynchronous. You're listening to it when you want to. And so you don't need to listen to the podcast when it comes out. And maybe you'll get to it a week later. Maybe you'll find a backlog of old shows that you want to that are interesting. That's all still true. And what the daily has proven is there is a utility for timeliness. You'll note that if you listen to the daily a lot, about half their shows are sort of riffing off something that happened yesterday, and they'll bring in Maggie Haberman to talk about whatever Trump did the day before. And then the other half of the shows are sort of long lead narrative pieces that are about something that's generally in the news but could have happened 6 months ago. And I think what we're learning is because the medium is evolving, there isn't an answer. Obviously, if you're making a podcast about news, it's much closer to radio. You need to think much more differently about how you're programming and how you're producing and how you're distributing it than if you're making something that has a long lead and evergreen. The nice thing is there's room for both.
Definitely. Ben has a question about editing software. I confessed I have never edited audio, so I'm probably not the best person to answer this. Do you know, Peter?
I am also in the never edited audio group. I'm someone who knows how to talk into a microphone.
All right, we'll see if we can find an answer and put it in the chat for you.
Rose had a question about podcast being collaborative, and I talked about this earlier. And it doesn't have to be. You can sit in your room and do this by yourself, and people are successful at that. But I would definitely try to find people to collaborate with on everything. They will have new ideas. They will have better ideas. They may just push you to think a little bit about what you're doing, and they will also help you get work done. So I would try to find, at a minimum, at least one other person to help you make your thing.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about podcasting is that, like, it is collaborative and it's an opportunity to work with others. And for me, having spent many years as a foreign correspondent where I was working alone in the field, it's actually really fun to work with lots of with lots of other people on a creative endeavor. So that's pretty neat. And just FYI, there are folks who are dropping into the chat suggestions on editing software. So that's there've been a couple of questions about pitching your podcast project to content publishers. I get a lot of pitches. Peter, I'm sure people bend your ear and ask for advice about pitching podcasts too. I don't know. You want to start? About like pitching?
No one has ever brought me. Well, people will bring you an idea. There's a difference, right? I have an idea for a podcast versus I have a podcast, right? The second thing is just like everything else. If you made the thing and you can say, here's what it is, I can show it to you. I have an audience. Then the people who work at the Vox Media Podcast Network get very excited. If it's just an idea, that's a lot harder to get across. It depends on your level of experience. Pitching anything, you're generally, no one is coming to you and saying, give me your pitch. You're sort of knocking on a door or stopping in the elevator, and you sort of are taking their time. And so you want to be able to effectively and quickly explain what the thing is, and not why it should be successful, but just why it solves a problem for that person you're pitching to.
Yeah, I think for us at Gimlet, where we're really invested in deep storytelling, and we see our audience as being knowledge seekers. Everything that we make is hard to make, and so when we decide to take on a project, it's because we just have like a deep and fervent belief that this is a story that needs to be told or a voice that needs to be heard. And so the number one thing that I look for is like, is there a vision, and can the person bringing me that vision bring it to life in sound? And so having that story having a really strong story about your vision and your passion, I think is absolutely essential. Often people bring us stories that are great ideas for a text story or great ideas for a documentary, but it don't really make sense as an audio story. So having a clear sense of what it means to bring that story to life in audio, and actually having some sound helps. If the show is, I want to host this show, then, bringing examples of your hosting style, or if, you're going to rely on exclusive audio, having, bringing that to the pitch and saying, like, I have this, very unusual and interesting asset that I can build my story around. I think those are very helpful things to have, and definitely make your pitches stand out. The world is awash in interview shows, celebrities interviewing people interviewing celebrities. So just remembering that, like, knowing what the overall landscape looks like and what your competition is for the type of thing that you want to do is really essential.
Misha has a question about majoring in the beat you're interested in. If you want to write about business, you'd major in economics and business. You could. It's very unlikely the thing you're going to end up doing is the thing you think you're going to end up doing. I'd use your time in college to expand your mind and do lots of fun things. I've been in business journalism most of my life. Very few of the people I work with have degrees in business or economics. Some of them do. They tend to be kind of weird people because they could be doing something else when they do journalism. I often find them very interesting. But the idea for any journalism basically is that if you are an inquisitive, interested person, you will learn about the thing that you are supposed to be writing about or podcasting about or broadcasting about. And you may be asked, by the way, this was standard of the New York Times and a lot of papers for a long time, to be moved to a different beat periodically and move to a different part of the world and expected to learn about it and be able to explain it to other people. I have kind of accidentally backed into a career where I have focused on one thing that I've chosen to focus on, but that was sort of mid-career for me. There certainly was no sort of major where I could figure out. There was no learning about the intersection of media and technology major available at the University of Wisconsin in the early 90s, and I doubt there is now. So that's a long-winded way of saying read and study widely and figure out what you want to do as you
go. There's a great question down here about what from Maggie, a common mistake that you notice a lot of beginner podcasts and podcasters making. Well, I think the first mistake a lot of folks make is just not understanding sort of the competitive landscape and what else is out there, and starting a podcast thinking that you've got a brilliant idea, without realizing that there are a lot of other people who are doing the same thing. I think that's a pretty common mistake that people make. And it's, anytime you're doing something in a space where there's already a very powerful and successful incumbent, you're making things pretty hard for yourself.
And this is, I think in general, by the way, I mean, like Lydia says, there are 1 million interview podcasts, and there are a lot of people trying to do versions of Serial. And I think all of us as listeners, but also podcasters and podcast publishers, would really benefit from people trying to do something beyond those two genres. They're both hard to do well, but there really wasn't a version of Serial before Serial came out. There were prototypes, I guess, on This American Life. But it was a new thing. There have to be other new things. You guys can help figure out what some of those things are, and we kind of won't know what they are until we see them. But again, you've got a ton of opportunity to experiment and try out different forms. And I'd really, you should definitely try to do a narrative podcast, and you should try to do an interview show, but please try to do something else as well.
Definitely agree. Okay. Shouldn't there be a platform like YouTube for podcasts? I don't know which app offers the same benefits for podcast creators like YouTube does, metrics, ads, etc. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I think that it'd be great for there to be a platform that didn't have the same problems that YouTube has in terms of, allowing for hateful content, allowing for, like really kind of terrible things to flourish and spread. And so I think I think, if there is an audio platform like that, I mean, in some ways, Spotify does play that role in that, you can upload your podcast to that network. We don't offer monetization for anything other than our owned and exclusive podcasts at this stage. But but I think you may well ended up with a platform like that. In some ways, there is a platform, and it's actually called YouTube. A lot of podcasters are on YouTube, and it is one of the biggest platforms for podcasts out there. So I think it may be that YouTube is that platform.
Lydia, I've got a question for you that's a little bit related to that. I think it is probably I think it's probably too early for anyone who's listening to this to be thinking about monetization. You can try and go for it. I'd be thinking about trying to figure out how to build your portfolio and do better work. I do think ownership of your work is an interesting thing to think about early on. You make something on your own, you own it. That's pretty straightforward. It's very likely that you are going to end up working for someone else for some period of time, and you may make a podcast for them. And I have to say, I'm a little surprised to see stories about people who now are upset that they don't have ownership of something they made while working for, say, BuzzFeed. I think this is also an issue at Gimlet. And it's come up around race. The question is coming up around race, but I think it applies universally. I didn't think there was an expectation that work you made while you worked for someone else should be your work. But that said, you can think about that when you go to work for someone and they ask you to make something. You can see, do I have any rights to this work? Can I have ownership of this work when I leave? And a lot of it just depends on sort of your leverage. The fact that you guys are talking to us now and you're in school means you probably have no leverage. And you probably can't ask for ownership. But one, it doesn't hurt to ask. And two, I'm wondering if that will change over time and what Lydia is seeing.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very live issue that a lot of people are talking about. Traditionally, if you're an employee of a media company, anything that you create while you're an employee belongs to the company. That certainly is the case. When I worked at the New York Times, when I worked at HuffPost, I think that this is an issue that a lot of people are focused on right now. But the reality is, Rachel Maddow does not own the Rachel Maddow Show. NBC, Universal owns the Rachel Maddow Show. So, but I think that this is something that a lot of people are thinking about and talking about right now, and I think it's a healthy conversation to be having. And there are a lot of really complicated issues involved in sorting through it. So, but I think we all kind of welcome the open dialogue about it.
Looking through questions. Oh, Lydia, someone wants to know about good podcasts on West Africa.
Man, I wish. One podcast that I have recently started listening to that I really love is a podcast called Afroqueer. And it is about, as the name describes, queer people, the stories of queer people in Africa, which is, something that I was kind of blown away exists. It's made by a really awesome podcast company that's based in Nairobi, and a really interesting group of creative people there that put out podcasts. The medium is still pretty young on the continent, but I think it has massive potential. I mean, radio obviously is terrestrial radio is a really big deal, and I remember being a little kid because I actually grew up in East and then West Africa, not in countries that I was from, but for us the BBC shortwave radio was a lifeline. So that kind of audio is I think there's a huge audience for it, and it'll be really cool to see that really take off and explode on the continent. But there's lots of good stuff out there that still needs to be created. In terms of what my favorite podcasts are, gosh, it's hard to choose. And there's so many. It's such a rich universe out there. If I just think about things that I've listened to in the past year or so, I was really blown away by Have You Heard George's podcast, which was put out by the BBC, and it is a guy called George the Poet. I'm not going to say much more about it, but you should definitely check it out. It is one of the most beautiful things I've listened to in a really long time. I suppose it's a little unfair to name podcasts made by my colleagues, but I was a fan of Startup from the very beginning, and that first season remains to me like one of the most important classics of the genre. I really love a podcast called The Dream, which was I think they've got a new season coming out now, but it was about multi-level marketing. And what I really loved about it was that it tackled the way in which multi-level marketing, and it really investigated the way that it sort of preys on women, particularly women who are homemakers. And I love that kind of accountability journalism. It's incredibly powerful. So those are a few. There are lots more I could name. Weirdly, now that I work in audio, I feel like I have less time to listen to podcasts because I'm just for fun, because I'm listening to them all the time for work. And there's just so much great work out there, and it's just really exciting to see.
My podcast consumption has gone way down, so it's much easier for me to tell you my favorite podcast because it's the one I make time for. It's called Improv for Humans. It's created by Matt Besser, who's one of the founding members of the Upright Citizens Brigade. If you've seen a movie in the last 20 years and it's a comedy, someone likely came out of the Upright Citizens Brigade. And it's straightforward. It's people doing improv comedy and recording it. And it's just a good example of something that I thought would never, ever work on a podcast. I'm a comedy nerd. I would go see improv comedy. It's on stage. People are moving around. They are playing off each other, and they're playing with the audience, and you can't do any of that. And they're that good that it works, which is a good lesson for me. Andrews had a question about lockdown and how that's affected podcast production. It's been a real bummer for me because I really insisted on doing all my podcasts interviews in person. I just thought it made for a much better interview, and I think I'm right. Obviously, I can't do that, so I've had to do it remotely. The good news is it has opened up the world. Everyone now gets the idea that they're going to have to do the podcast from their home. When you're talking to executives who are used to having multiple levels of assistance, they don't have them, and they're kind of with the program, and they're willing to hold an iPhone up to their mouth while they talk. We use a software called Squadcast, which kind of works okay. Tends to break a lot. But the idea is whether we're using Squadcast or Zoom, we'll record that conversation. And then we also record locally. I'll record on QuickTime on my Mac. And then we generally want our guests to literally hold their phone up to their ear and record a voice memo. And it certainly doesn't sound as good as studio, but it usually sounds okay, which is another good lesson that I work with a lot of audio people who like really have high audio standards, and they've been forced to relax them. And I think the audience is okay with it. I work with people who will spend a day trying to get a music cue just right. And for a narrative podcast, you still want to do that. But at least for an interview show, I think if the audio is acceptable, it's fine. And I think overall that's been a good thing for us.
I know, I totally agree. And I think the funniest thing for me was listening to Fresh Air, Terry Gross's interview podcast, and she was interviewing Jane Mayer. And it was so weird that I suddenly heard a siren, which presumably was the siren outside of Jane Mayer's apartment in, I think she lives in Washington, D.C. And it just jolted me because, I'm used to that show being such a kind of hermetically sealed box, and they take such care. And Terry Gross is notorious for never wanting to be in the same studio with her guests. She doesn't like to look at people, so it's been interesting to see how people adapt. For us, I think it's been a mixed bag. It's been great to be able to keep to get a broader diversity of folks. Of folks, because you're not just focused on who you can physically get to or do a tape sync with. It's also we do a bunch of fiction podcasts, so we're doing the newest season of The Two Princes, and it's been really exciting to be able to do do recording sessions with some of the stars, people like Noah Galvin and Samira Wiley, literally recording in their closets. And so to be on a video screen with them while they do their lines is pretty neat. On the other hand, I think it's made travel really, really hard. And there are certain kinds of journalism that you really need to show up for. It's one thing to do an interview with someone who's going to pick up the phone when you call and answer your questions. But if you have to go knock on somebody's door and confront them with facts, or doorstop somebody about, a chemical dump that their company did in a local river or something like that, that's IRL journalism that can't really be done any other way. And so, we've definitely had to rearrange our schedule and scramble some things in order to accommodate the fact that we just can't travel in the way that we'd like to. We're taking some baby steps, doing some field work, but very, very cautiously, and with a lot of prep and sanitizer. So it's tough. Well, guys, I think this is all we have time for, but this has been really fun. I've enjoyed all of your questions. It's been really neat to see such thoughtful, creative minds. Coming for the profession. That's great for us at Gimlet and Spotify.
I echo what Lydia said. Thank you, guys. I wish you all luck. And I guess you can find our emails, right? You can bug us.
Sure. Yeah. Mine is Lydia at gimletmedia.com. Easy to find me.
Peter at recode.net. Enjoy. Good luck. Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye, guys.